Hey everybody, how are you doing? This is Liberty. I appreciate you tuning in. Our guest this evening is Jim Marrs. He is an investigative journalist. He is a New York Times best-selling author. His book Crossfire was used as a source for Oliver Stone's movie JFK. His other books include Alien Agenda, Rule by Secrecy, Psyops, Psy Spies, The Terror Conspiracy, Rise of the Fourth Reich, Above Top Secret, The $1 Trillion Conspiracy, and his latest release, Our Occulted History, Do the Global Elite Conceal Ancient Aliens? I appreciate you joining us this evening, Jim.
Hey, Chris, it's great to be with you.
All right. I wanted to get started and get a little background on you. I hear that you grew up in Texas over in and worked for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram for a little while. I was kind of curious, given the culture of news media that we have today, it really seems more like it's just a big PR firm for government and big business. Can you give us a little bit of insight of what it was like when you were an investigative reporter back in the 60s in that era?
Yep, that's true. Well, see, I tell people that I never left journalism. I committed to be a journalist back in the university in the early 60s. And so I never left journalism, but I have to admit that journalism left me. I watched it all happen. When I first went to work, it was I went to work for the Star-Telegram. It was a family-owned newspaper, and my only real complaint with them was that I thought that they were a little bit too Chamber of Commerce. It was always yay for our town, yay for what's going on. I know they used to put the grand champion steer of the rodeo and stock show on the front page, and I thought, well, that's not real news, and that ought to be back on Society or Sports or something. But I found out that there's worse things than rah-rah for your hometown. And that is, over the years, while I was there, because of government pressure, they said it's not right for one person, one owner, to have radio and the TV station and the newspaper in a particular town, so they forced everybody to divest themselves. And so the Carter family, which owned WBAP-TV and Channel 5 and the Star-Telegram, decided to divest themselves of everything except the TV station, which made the most money. Well, so the newspaper was then picked up by a series of corporate owners, and it just went downhill worse and worse. And the irony of it is that under I believe it was the Clinton administration, where Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, and his son, Michael Powell, became head of the Federal Communications Agency, and they suddenly reversed everything now that all the corporations owned all the media, and said, well, okay, it's not so bad if one owner owns both the TV, radio station, and all the media in one location, and so that's what's getting to now. And so there is very little competition and very little alternative voice. So all you're basically getting from your news media is official news and information, and it's come straight from the government, and they are never questioned. If you don't believe me, just go call up your public television station and say, hey, I'm a member of the public, and I contribute regularly to your station, so I'm paid in, so I'm kind of like a part owner. Could I have 5 minutes of airtime to just say what I want to say? And I promise you it won't be litigious. It won't be any foul language, won't be any name-calling or personality problems. I just want to state my beliefs, see how far you get. You're not going to get on.
Yeah, I hear you. It seems like if you're not connected to Clear Channel or Viacom, you're probably not going to get on the air unless you've got a lot of money and very little to say.
That's unfortunately about right. Now, of course, thank God we've still got a somewhat vibrant alternative media going, but it's always tough trying to get the signal through the noise of the corporate mass media. And you mentioned Viacom. That's one of the major networks, one of the major corporate entities. There's only about 5 that control everything, and Project Censored has found that these 5 have interlocking directorships and ownership. So actually, you're talking about a handful of people who control everything that we see and hear. And I'm not just talking about news now. I'm talking about radio, TV, cable, satellite, magazines, film, movies, TV, cable, billboards, magazines, you name it. They control everything. In fact, what's kind of makes me wonder is the largest print publisher in the English language is Bertelsmann, a privately held company in Germany, and during World War II, they were the largest publishers of Nazi propaganda, and they are now the largest publishers in the English language. What? It's and once you really find out about it, what's going on and who's behind everything, it kind of makes you wonder what's happening.
I agree. It's they say that behind every great fortune there's a great crime, and it seems like, if nothing else, that the Third Reich and Hitler and his Nazi movement just brought a ton of American corporations into the big business sphere.
Well, it was American corporations and the Bank of England and British corporations who funded Hitler, created Hitler. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just historic fact. And what's really irony is that these same corporations and these same moneyed families are the ones who created communism in Russia. You see, after the Tsar was overthrown, and one of the reasons they wanted to overthrow the Tsar is because he refused to have a central bank, and the international bankers wanted to get hold of that vast resources of Russia and those potential consumers. So they helped push along the Russian Revolution. And after the revolution started, according to Woodrow Wilson, who was a U.S. president, the bulk of the money that went to Russia did not go to the White Russians or the Kerensky government. It went to the Bolsheviks, who created communism. And I think the idea was to create a socialist East to compete with the capitalist West. And we saw this happen within my lifetime. It was called the Cold War. But back in the 1920s, once Lenin died and Stalin took over, then Russia became a dictatorship. And again, they refused to let the international bankers come in. They didn't want them cutting in. The communist leadership was the one taking all the money, and they didn't want any competition. So at that, the international bankers, got really incensed. And then to add to this, you had they created the Internationale, which was the movement to try to take communism worldwide. And the rallying cry was "Workers of the World Unite." Okay, and boy, that got the capitalists going, and of course all the aristocrats and the very moneyed people from Russia fled, and they went to Paris and London and New York and various other big cities, and told all the horror tales about how that their property had been confiscated, and how that there had been some atrocities committed, and of course that gave rise to the fear of communism. So all of a sudden now, we had to fear a international communist conspiracy. So in an effort to block the spread of communism, these same banks and businesses, including Ford Motor Company, IBM, Standard Oil, et cetera, they all poured money into Germany. And they found a German army intelligence agent who had served honorably during World War I, but then tried his hand at being an artist and wasn't doing very well. So he was still on the payroll as an informant. So they got him to go and infiltrate a small political party. I say small. There's only 9 members. It was called the German Workers' Party, and he came back and told his military authorities, "You're going to like these guys. They think that we were stabbed in the back in World War I, and they want to see a new military built up in Germany, and they want Germany to regain its prestige and honor." So the military along with the Occulted Gesellschaft, or the Fool Society, poured money into this army corporal, and of course that was Adolf Hitler. And pretty soon he renamed the German Workers' Party the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And it's very important to understand that the German acronym for National Socialist is NAZI, Nazi. So he formed the Nazi Party, and it was just as socialist as the Communist Party, but it was National Socialism. So they didn't mind the socialism, they just didn't want it spreading worldwide, because then they couldn't play one country off against another for the profit and for control. And of course then Hitler got out of hand and invaded all the other countries of Europe and had took North Africa, and pretty soon it looked like they'd created yet another Frankenstein monster. And so they had to get 26 nations together and fight World War II to stop the spread of National Socialism. But in my book, The Rise of the Fourth Reich, what you'll find is that we beat the Germans in World War II, but we never beat the Nazis. When the surrender was signed at the Reims Courthouse in 1945, there was nobody representing the Nazis there. And that was strictly the German military that surrendered. And the Nazis, we just simply forced them to move. And where'd they go? Well, they went to Egypt, they went to Chile, and went to Argentina, and a bunch of countries around the world, but thousands of them came to the United States under the aegis of Project Paperclip. Now, we know that we got their rocket scientists and brought them over here, but what most people don't know is we also brought their mind control experts, and we brought their money, and we brought their corporate business over here, and we rolled it into our military-industrial complex, and they also brought us nuclear technology. In fact, we were beginning at the end of the war to be afraid now of the communists. We were back to the fear of international communism. So the Nazis said, we'll swap you nuclear technology in exchange for immunity. So, some of the more better-known Nazis, like Hermann Goering and Himmler, and some of them either committed suicide or were sentenced at the Nuremberg trials. But other top Nazis, including Morton Bormann, chief of staff to Hitler, and by some very reliable reports, even Hitler himself escaped, fled, and lived out his years down in Argentina, protected by the Perón government. And all this is pretty well documented, but it's never told anybody, because when we got their technology, we also got their ideology. And that's why that over the years we saw more and more fascism rising in this country. And fascism is defined as the combining of state and corporate power. And that's exactly what we see in the United States today. And it began when one president decided that, and I think he had some insight into what was happening, and tried to put some curbs on the military-industrial complex that Dwight Eisenhower warned us against. He got it through his head that they weren't going to put up with that, and of course that was John F. Kennedy and the coup of 1963. And then they began to get tighter and tighter control after that. It really picked up speed during the Reagan years, and Reagan may have personally been a decent person, but for those who don't remember, he was shot, less than 2 months after he took office, and who was actually running the country was George Herbert Walker Bush. And in fact, if that bullet had been just a fraction of an inch to one side, it probably would have hit Reagan's heart. We would have had Bush 8 years sooner than we did. And then when the Bushes came and overtly took over, we had neoconservatism, the neocons that everybody heard about, but nobody quite understood what that meant. Well, the neocons was simply a modern, cleaned-up version of the National Socialist, and they were practicing the same theology and the same philosophies as the Nazis, which was basically the end justifies the means, strong national defense, foreign military adventurism, And of course, in a very telling neocon document, the Rebuilding America's Defenses in the 21st Century, that was issued in September of 2000, it said that it called for greater military adventures in the Middle East and to gain control over their oil supplies, and tighter controls here at home, less liberty, and more centralized authoritarian government. But the authors of this paper were pretty prescient. They said this is going to be kind of a hard sell to the American public unless there is a catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Well, interestingly enough, just 1 year later, in September of 2001, we got that catalyzing and catastrophic event. It was, of course, 9/11. Mm-hmm. And we still don't know the truth of that. What we do know is that John Farmer, who was the senior counsel to the official 9/11 commission that was appointed by President Bush, George W., to look into the attacks of 9/11, the worst terrorist attack in American history, and find out what happened, has publicly stated that the story that was given to them and presented to the Congress and the media and the public about who knew what and when on 9/11 was entirely and inexplicably untrue. Wow. Mm. So the story that we all think we know is untrue. And that's why I've long said we shouldn't be looking down on people who are raising Cain about 9/11 and trying to point out that it has every indication of being an inside job, and they say, yeah, well, that's just conspiracy theory, just looking for stuff, and probably unpatriotic. And I go, wait a minute, what's unpatriotic about trying to find out about this terrible event that happened to us that the head of their own commission, the legal head, says the story they gave us is untrue?
Yeah, it seems like there is a serious amount of propaganda, and they've got a whole slew of derogatory terms and remarks to use against anybody that questions the official story, and really it's the irony is being called a conspiracy theorist as a derogatory remark. I remember I just listened to your book. Also, I cheated a little bit. In our Occulted History, I downloaded the audiobook version from Audible, and just got done listening to that, and I was noticing some things in there that it's great that this information is getting out, and I thank you for putting your name and probably your life on the line by getting this information out there. I remember 10 years ago just bringing up the fact that Bush was in the Skull and Bones. People looked at me like I had two heads, and nowadays it's just a given fact. Nobody even it's just regarded as fact. And these Bushes, I tell you, reaching back into the Third Reich and some of that conspiracy, really the nature of the conspiracy, which our Occulted History is pretty much a compendium of all the conspiracies back to the beginning of recorded history, but specifically these Bushes. I tell you, the Prescott Bush, he was also heavily involved in Hitler's regime and things like that as a banker. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. He was a director of Union Banking Corporation, and as such, he was in charge of investments and sending loans to Nazi Germany. And in fact, in late 1942, this was almost halfway through World War II, he was prosecuted by the federal government of the United States under the Trading with the Enemies Act, and charged with being just a financial front man for Hitler and the Nazis. But he wasn't the only one. As I said, IBM, Ford, Standard Oil, the Rockefeller Oil, even the Dulles brothers, Allen Dulles, who became head of the CIA, and his brother John Foster Dulles, who became Secretary of State under Eisenhower. They were lawyers for Sullivan and Cromwell out in New York, which represented the von Schroeder Bank, which was the lead banker for Adolf Hitler. John J. McCloy, who during the 30s was CEO of National City Bank, which is today Citicorp, sat in Hitler's box in the 1936 Olympics. And these were all people who were supporting the Nazis, and again, it was because of the fear of the communism, which they also had supported. So we need to understand that you've got this group of people who are trying to run the world, and they think that they have the right to tell everybody else how to live, and they certainly have the clout because they control the banks and the flow of the money. And as we all know, here in the United States, we live under the golden rule. Whoever has the gold makes the rules. And if you don't believe it, just look around you. I'm always saying we have the best criminal justice system that money can buy.
Absolutely. And speaking of the people who feel it necessary to deem themselves as the moderators of the entire human race, that reminds me of the beginning of your book, Our Occulted History. You get into what it seems to be a recurring subject matter, and after I read your book, it really kind of put the top on it for me. It's like, well, of course, this is the natural place that we would start, is Sumeria, because this is the basis of the hierarchical behavior throughout history that it seems to, as civilization appeared out there, it seems like that was our very first conspiracy, and that was when we were, of course, as it's, the theory goes, that we were genetically manipulated by alien visitors for the purpose of harvesting our resources, specifically gold, for various reasons. And that's pretty much where the conspiracy of the human race starts, more or less, as far as I can see.
Right. Well, let me point out here, because I can already hear somebody in your audience is going, is this crazy guy trying to say we was created by aliens? No. You have to understand, this was not a creation of a process. It's really interesting, Chris, because even in the ancient Sumerian tablets, it's written down and recorded that they had the same ethical arguments that we are having today over gene splicing and cloning and genetic manipulation. They said it is not our place to play God. Only God can create living things, and that's true. And what was explained by their science officer, Inky, was that, well, wait a minute, we're not creating anything. We're simply improving the breed. Okay, it's a breeding program. Sure. And, if you think about it, this is what we've done all through history with animals, okay? Sheep, cattle, horses, dogs, cats. We breed them to get a better or a different breed, and that's all in the world they did. They didn't create the human race, but they kind of tweaked us a little bit, and that's why that all of my life, the scientists, the anthropologists have been searching for that missing link between early man, Neanderthal, and modern man, Cro-Magnon, and they really haven't been able to find it, and that's because apparently there is none. They took a primitive Earth being and they tweaked his DNA, and then bingo, there was the modern man. But it was not a creation; it was simply improving the breed.
Right on. Yeah, that's definitely. These are the high priests of science that we're dealing with here, and I say that as almost tongue-in-cheek, because they tend to control the flow of information just as sternly as the religious people did in the former days.
Well, that's because science today has become its own cult, its own religion, and there are some people who are so wedded to left-brain science that they just refuse to acknowledge that there might be anything else in the universe. But what I would say to them is, surely at some point in their life, they've experienced love. They love their mother, or they love their parents, or they love their spouse, or maybe they just love their dog. But surely they've experienced love, and they would not argue that love does not exist, because it does exist, and yet it can't be quantified. You can't hold love under a microscope, and you can't weigh it on a scale. and yet it's there, it's real. So what's the big problem in understanding that there's things in the universe that we might not be able to totally dissect and explain scientifically?
Right, and that reminds me, I remember the point that you made in your book, Our Occulted History, is that religion was pretty much undone by the advent of the printing press, and what that achieved was the ability for people to research the information for themselves and come up with their own opinion and kind of compare notes with what they were getting from their local religious leaders or from on high with the Pope and everything. It seems like that's being duplicated in modern times by the internet. What we've got is kind of a crowdsourcing effort to on different forums and in different chat rooms and on our different forms of super communication that the internet provides to us. We're getting a chance to go over this information, the scientific information that they're the cards that they're holding real close to their chest, and we're finding that some of this stuff isn't working out quite the way that we were taught in high school or even in grade school.
That's right. We can call some of that into question now. Well, you're absolutely right. Of course, the upside of the internet is that anybody and everybody has access to the internet. But you know what the downside is?
What's that?
Anybody and everybody has access to the internet. So you have to be judicious. And you have to be a little careful on the internet. You can't just buy into anything, and likewise, you don't want to just dismiss anything. I think the internet's going to cause us all. See, in the past, if Walter Cronkite said it on CBS, or if the president said it, then if J. Edgar Hoover says 2 + 2 is 5, we go, that's funny, I always thought it was 4, but I guess it must be 5. And we just accepted these experts. But today, with the internet and with so many things that we thought were true being called into question, we've all got to start thinking for ourselves. And yes, I know it's a headache and it's a hassle and it's painful sometimes, but if you're going to function as a free human being, you have to have free access of truthful information. And no matter how bad things may be, or no matter, you may say, I don't want to hear that, but nevertheless, if you don't deal with that, then you're not dealing with reality, and you're going to be in trouble, and you'll never figure out what's going on in the world.
Absolutely. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
For example, the subject of UFOs. Okay, and a lot of people go, "Oh, UFOs out." Surely you don't really believe in that stuff. Well, it's not a question of belief. Okay, the controversy over whether or not UFOs exist, that's long over with. Okay, they're real. They're here. And if you don't believe me, just go on the internet and type in UFOs, and you'll find so many pictures and films and articles that'll keep you busy from now on. So there's definitely something there. The question is no longer, are they real? The question is, well, exactly what are they, and who's guiding them, and what do they want? And the one thing I can tell you is that it's not a modern phenomenon. It didn't just start with the crash in 1947, or even the flying saucer flaps of the 1950s. It goes all the way back. I mean, you've got Ezekiel in the Bible. He sees the fiery wheel flying through the air, and it picks him up. It takes him to a city, and he wanders around, and he sees they're showing him everything. And when he says, "What's in that building?" they say, "Well, that's where the vision of God is," the very thing that he used to describe this thing flying around. Then you go back to the Vayamas of the Hindus, and we some of the oldest writing in the history of the world, and they talk about the Vayamas. These circular craft that were flying through the skies could devastate a whole city with one weapon. And they got cave dwellings, cavemen who were scrawled pictures of what appear to be people in spacesuits and big heads and large eyes and antennas sticking out, all kinds of weird things going on. Were they just maybe eating one too many mushrooms, or were they trying to depict what they had actually seen? You've just got every culture around the world, from Asia to Central South America to Africa to Australia. they all have ancient tales of these gods who arrive and fly through the air and confront them and show them how to do things, and make a wheel, start fire, do farming. Here's how to make a language, you know. So it's time we start taking this stuff seriously, because we've been kept in the dark for way too long.
I agree, and it was an interesting paradigm shift when I first started looking at the information you present, and a few other people have kind of pieced together. It's I've always kind of looked at it as like a religious thing, as like this is heaven, and it's this other thing that I can't even really understand that exists somewhere in some other time. But when you get down to comparing, I mean, almost every single civilization, all of their creation myths, if you want to call it that, they all say someone came down from the sky and they created or manipulated, or in some way or another brought us into being. And it's like, well, if you take away the superstition and the supernatural kind of mystical religious stuff about that, look at it like history, that it sounds like aliens came to Earth and dabbled with our DNA and stuff a little bit.
Right. Of course, there are those who would argue and says, well, actually they were demons, and then you got some who'd say, no, it was angels, But then that's just a personal perspective, okay? Let's say you and I and another fellow are walking through the woods, and a little diminutive green figure runs out of the woods, runs across our path, and runs off into the woods. You might say, wow, I just saw an alien. And the other fellow might say, wow, I just saw a demon. And I might say, well, I saw a leprechaun, but hey, that's our personal perspective. The reality of the being still there.
Absolutely. I agree with you. This kind of puts us in perspective. I've got a couple of questions from the listeners popping up here, if you wouldn't mind taking a stab at them. Sure.
Well, as we say in the Nation research community, shoot.
Okay, this first one, it's a little bit technical, and I understand you're not a scientist, it's a reporter, so if this isn't something that you can answer, you just go right ahead and tell us. The first part of the question, can you tell us about the source of propelling across a vacuum? And the second part of that is, if there are other beings elsewhere in the universe, and there probably are, they would be under the same prohibitions of traveling outside of their planetary boundaries. Would you agree with that?
Well, I didn't really hear it in the form of a question, but I know what they're getting at, which is your left brain to say, well, there's no way that we can go visit any other inhabitable planet, because it's probably another star system, and you're talking light years, and it would take you too long. If you left here on a rocket ship and tried to go to Alpha Centauri, for example, it might take you 100 years to get there and 100 years back, and there's just no way that's going to happen. But the problem with that whole thinking and that whole question is that it's being geared around the assumption that they're going to use some sort of a fueled rocket, like we see in all the movies and everything, and obviously that's not going to get it. If you'll really study the UFO phenomena, you'll find that they're not propelled by rockets or ramjets or anything like that. They operate in energy fields, okay? And when you, particularly a revolving vortex energy, in fact, if you'll think about the cosmos, in our solar system, the planets revolve around the sun, and then our sun revolves around the core of the Milky Way galaxy, and the whole galaxy spins. What makes it spin? All right, it's energy. It's the manipulation of energy. And if you manipulate energy, then you can come up with all kinds of exotic technology. And it's hard for me to explain because we don't have it yet. But theoretically, you've got your Einstein-Rosen bridge, which says that you could, if you can manipulate the energy of the universe, then you can fold space. If you can fold space and create a wormhole, then going from A to B, which might take you, 100 light years, you fold it, and you could get there in a matter of seconds, or certainly minutes. So see, it's assuming that we and everybody else in the universe has to use the primitive technology that we're stuck with. But no, they don't really have to do that. In fact, what we're finding out more and more is that time and gravity are interconnected in some way. And this is why when the UFO comes over with its energy field, then the cars stop. We all know that. It's in the literature. Everybody says the cars stop when the UFO comes by. And then when it goes away, the cars start up again. And yet nobody ever says, I turned on the ignition and started the car. It's simply that the car stopped, and then it stops, starts, and then it starts. And that's because when the energy field surrounds it, it freezes time. And those pistons just freeze, and everything stops. Okay? And this also explains another phenomena of the UFO issue, which is missing time. You see the UFO at 6 o'clock, and you go right home, and it only took you about 5 or 10 minutes, and yet when you get home, it's 7 o'clock. What happened to the other 50 minutes? You know, it's because when you're in the energy field, both gravity and time have stopped or are not operating the way that we are accustomed to. So there are advanced technologies there that we are not yet aware of and that we certainly don't have command of, and this could explain how that others who do know this technology can travel around through the universe.
Yeah, I agree. It seems interesting to me that the field of electromagnetics, it's kind of suspiciously missing from mainstream scientific studies. And anytime I think about something like that, I imagine somebody's probably doing it in a lab somewhere that we know nothing about.
That's right. Well, and it'd be slapped with a national security classification anyway. Back in the early 50s, there were some publications quoting Bill Lear, the inventor of the Learjet, and other aviation pioneers that were talking about anti-gravity. And they said that's going to be the next generation, and they were talking as if not just speculating, but flatly stating that that's what they were going to. And of course, the Germans were working on that in World War II and possibly passed us that same technology. But then all of a sudden, that goes dark, and from then on. Today, you ask a reputable scientist about anti-gravity, and they'll either snicker or they'll run out of the room because they don't want to deal with it because they know that that's not something you're supposed to be talking about. And yet there are those who claim that they have developed that. In fact, there was some scientific experiments done where they've been able to negate gravity in certain types of experiments. So it is possible. We just don't have that as a publicly available technology right now. And of course, that gets into some weird areas because there are those who claim that we already have operating bases on the moon and perhaps Mars and perhaps even other planets, and maybe even operating a space fleet right at this time. That's why Gary McKinnon, he got in trouble with the Pentagon because he hacked in trying to find out about UFOs, and now he's a fugitive over in England, and our government's trying to extradite him, want to put him in prison forever, even though they admit that he did no harm. Okay, well then why are they down on him? Why do they want him back so they can prosecute him? Because he says when he hacked into the Pentagon computers, he found the listings, names, and documentation of a space fleet.
I'll tell you what, you just read my mind because that was the next question I was fixing to ask was about Gary McKinnon. It was a very interesting situation. I'm glad to see that it got resolved without him doing any jail time or anything like that here in the States.
Right.
Lord knows what they'd have done with him. I'd like to remind everybody listening that you could check out Jim's website, jimmars.com, JIMMARRS.com. He's got some videos on there. He's got he's got a full list of his books and some other information that's on there too. Jim, let me ask you this. This is another question from the website. Do you believe that reptilians are on Earth?
Oh, hello.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
You said reptilians, and all of a sudden you went away.
Oh, sorry. Oh, not good. Not good. Do you have a position on the various types of aliens that have visited, with the possibility of one of those races being reptilian and maybe even still being here on Earth as the second part?
No, not really. As far as I know, I don't know of any aliens that are currently on the Earth, although I do have some questions about certain rock singers. But, and so I wouldn't want to, I try to stick with things that I can either prove or that have some substantive information and facts behind it, and I try not to theorize any more than I have to. But it does seem, though, from all of the material and everything I know, that we're not dealing with just one extraterrestrial race. There are several out there, and of course, then you get in a problem because some people say, "Well, there's only two, and I know one of them," and other people say, "No, there's 19," and others say, "No, there's 72." And personally, I'm just a little bit leery about anyone who says, "Oh, I know, there's 104, and they come from here, here, and here." Because I'm not sure that anybody knows that for sure. I'm not even sure that the visiting ETs know that, because I think we've got various races visiting this planet, and I think the only real commonality is that they all adhere to what Star Trek calls the Prime Directive, which is perhaps not even in the form of a law, in that we understand a law, which is something codified, and there's punishments and there's enforcers if you break it, but more like a universal understanding that it's just not right, it's not proper to overtly interfere with the natural evolution of a intelligent species. So I think that's why that we don't have an overt presence here on this planet. I think there are people visiting here. I think there may even be people among us, but we don't know that. You can't prove that because they're laying low, and I think there's a good reason for that. There's been too many instances of where a ship comes into view, and the first step that the humans do is start shooting at it. So, I can understand that they'd probably be a little bit hesitant about just landing and say, "Hey, here we are. We come in peace." That would just throw everything into turmoil, the political system, the religious system, and I think they know better than to do that. In fact, we can see that this type of thinking is now beginning to dominate our own scientific culture. Back in the early 90s, while they were clear-cutting some of the Amazon rainforest, they stumbled across a tribe still living down there that was basically in the Stone Age. And instead of rushing in with Bibles and clothing and weapons, as has been done in the past, they actually cordoned off the area, not to keep them in, but to keep others out, so that they could not just totally disrupt their culture. And what they did was get a group of scientists together, anthropologists and archaeologists and sociologists, and they would allow themselves to be seen at a distance. And then over time, as the natives became more and more accustomed to the fact that they were there and began to realize that they weren't a danger, then they got a little closer, and pretty soon they were across the field waving and, smiling. And then, over a period of time, they managed to finally make contact. And when they made contact, about the only thing they did to try to help those people's lifestyle was to give them some metal tools, knives and shovels and some things like that could actually really improve their quality of life. But they didn't do anything to overtly just destroy their culture. So we are beginning to understand that, and I think that the same thing is happening to us as a species on this planet. I think they're letting themselves be seen, and they are slowly conditioning us to the idea that we're not alone, so that when there is open contact, it's not going to be a super traumatic event. This is the reason for all the government secrecy up till now, is because back in the 50s, they did a study about what happens when an advanced culture comes into direct contact with a more primitive culture. And they found, based on Earth history, that the more primitive culture gets destroyed one way or another. It either gets assimilated or it just gets destroyed. And I guess the Native North Americans is the classic example. They were here living their lives, and then the Europeans arrived, and before long they were all on reservations or not there anymore. So they decided that we didn't want that, so they decided that they were going to institute a policy of denial and ridicule. They deny that anything's happening. They deny that the UFOs exist. They deny that there's any life outside of the Earth. And if you persist in saying, well, I saw them, I know it's there, then it's ridicule. It's, well, you probably need psychiatric examination. And this particular policy really incenses me, because there have been so many lives ruined by people who know what they saw and tried to tell the truth. And yet they, if not institutionalized or jailed by the government, they are, made fun of, and have the public turns their back on them and makes fun of them and ridicules them. And that's changing now, thank goodness, but that's the way it's been in the past, and that's what's kept this issue from becoming more publicly acknowledged than it is.
Well, that brings me to my next question. Speaking of people who have had their lives ruined by conspiracies and cover-ups and things of that nature, I'm curious, have you done any research on Nikola Tesla? He seemed to have some connections, like I think his father worked at the Vatican, so there's some theories working their way through our forum that he might have had access to some occult information, and that's what gave him such a leg up on his scientific research. How do you feel about that, Jim?
Well, I'll say two things. Number one, yes, I'm fairly familiar with Tesla. Not as much as I'd like to be, because after his death in, I believe, 1942, the federal government took all of his files, took all his materials, and hid them away, and they're still hidden. We still don't know the full ramifications of his technology, and yet, if you go back and really look, the things he was working with was energy manipulation, drawing energy from the Earth, transmitting energy without the use of wires and poles and everything else. So, and that's why George Westinghouse cut the funding to him, because he suddenly realized that his whole electrical grid that he was setting up and making millions off of might become obsolete if and people could become energy independent using Tesla technology. So they dismissed him as a madman and drove him into poverty, and like so many other people and scientists that I could name. It's happened all over the place, and for years. Rudolf Diesel, the fellow that invented the diesel engine, he invented the diesel engine to run on organic matter, okay? So we could use grass and I don't know, orange peels, kind of like the Back to the Future, where they put the banana peel in the atomic motor. And yet today all we get is the diesel engine that runs on compressed gasoline, or petroleum. The gas is off of petroleum. And what happened to diesel? Oh, it was terrible. He fell overboard crossing the English Channel. So, this is at least Tesla got to live a few more decades before he ended up. But so it was all energy manipulation, and this is what we need to be aware of and need to start studying, because that's what we could be doing. For example, today, instead of burning the petroleum and polluting the planet, we should be using hydrogen. Hydrogen can be bottled and can be shipped down the same pipelines and pretty much utilized by the same infrastructure that we're now using petroleum. And it's the most abundant substance in the universe. This planet is 3/4 water, and water is H2O, 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. So we got more hydrogen than we know what to do with. And if you burn hydrogen for energy, for either as fuel or to turn turbines to generate electricity, all you're using is you're not having any pollution. for example, if you burn hydrogen to heat water and create steam, push the steam through a generator to create electricity, and then the steam, when it's used, goes into a collecting tank, and it condenses back into pure drinking water. Okay, so it's not exactly a perpetual motion machine, but it's pretty close. If we had a device that had an electrolyzing plate in it and separates the hydrogen and oxygen, burn the hydrogen, and then use water as a coolant, and then push it through a generator, and then put it in the holding tank, the only waste product you're going to have is pure water. And the only fuel you're going to use is occasionally you're going to have to put a little more water in there. So, there are ways of doing these things, but we're not being told that, and the corporate world and the bankers that fund them, they don't want us to know these things.
I agree. One other thing I wanted to talk about before we let go of you, probably the biggest thing that stuck out in your book, the occulted history. It seemed like, besides the overall conspiracy that's basically been what our history has been about, it seems like the overreaching, the underlying theme of all of these different conspiracies seem to kind of huddle around gold, and specifically the possibility of in the old days the alchemy working with it, and nowadays the probably some newer machinery that they've got on the scene. It's the and you'll have to help me out here, the orbitally rearranged
monatomic elements.
Yes, that right there. Specifically the white powder gold that was referred to as manna in the Old Testament. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, that's in the Old Testament we learn that the Israelites, when they fled Egypt, wandered around out in the wilderness for 40 years. Well, what did they eat? Well, they ate manna, which literally means, what is it? They didn't know. But they'd wake up in the morning and they'd find this white powder lying around on the ground, and they'd gather it up and they'd add a little water and they'd pat it into little cakes and they'd bake it, and that was their food. And they didn't know what it was. It's interesting because you go further back and you find that the Egyptians, particularly the pharaohs and the educated Egyptians who had knowledge of the ancient technology handed down from the ancient flying gods, in the Book of the Dead, the pharaoh on the way to the afterlife would stop at the various stations and say, what is it? And they had what they called the conical bread, or the mafuz, and it also was a white powder. So they had knowledge of this white powder, and this white powder apparently was monatomic gold. There are monatomic single-atom elements of gold, uranium, silver, platinum that's found in all the food we eat, all the water we drink. It's everywhere, but it's just very, very small and in minute quantities. But yet, if you can produce it through a heating process, you can change it from into actual material gold, or you can reverse it back into this powder. The powder has anti-gravity properties, because when they put this powder into a weighing pan, the pan itself weighs 44% less than it did before you put the powder in it. And this may explain the whole idea of the Ark of the Covenant, because you see pictures of 4 or 5 guys carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and yet when you read the description of it, the mercy lid was made of solid gold and was several inches thick, which means it probably weighed more than a ton. So how does 4 or 5 guys carry 2,000 pounds around? Well, apparently they didn't. They simply guided it because it was floating off, and is also creating an energy field that was hazardous, because, again, you read the Old Testament, and when people went up and tried to grab it or hold on to it, it would shock them or kill them, with some sort of radiation. In fact, we see hints of all this even in the Bible. I like the story of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, who built a structure out of gold that's been come down to us translated as a fiery furnace, but obviously that was not it, because people would go in and come out. And yet when his people went in, it obviously created a hazardous energy field, because his people would get sick and die. So he went and got the three Hebrew priests, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and told them, brought them to Babylon, and said, "You're going to make this work." And they said, "No, you're not our king. You don't believe in our God, and we're not going to work for you." He said, "Well, I'm going to throw you in. You either make it work or you're going to die." And so, interestingly enough, he didn't just chunk them in there. The Bible makes it very clear that first they donned their raiments, their cloaks, and their hats. Well, what's that got to do with anything? Well, did they put on some sort of radiation suit, some kind of clothing that could protect them? But anyway, if you'll keep reading the story, which I believe is in the book of Daniel, don't give me the line, you'll find that he put the three priests in there, and he didn't want to go anywhere near it, so he said, "Are they in there?" And his men said, "Well, yeah, but there's 4 people in there now." And he said, "Oh, who's the 4th person?" They said, "Well, it's a son of God." Whoops, wait a minute, a son of God in the Old Testament? Well, whatever happened to him? We don't know, because that was never followed up on. But what we do know is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were then, Nebuchadnezzar was so impressed with what they had done that he put them in charge of the whole empire. He put them in charge of Babylon. And I think it's interesting to note that Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, which is exactly where all this was happening, that's where Babylon was, that's where Sumer was, so Saddam Hussein believed himself the reincarnated Nebuchadnezzar, and he was rebuilding Babylon. So I think he was after this ancient ET technology, and he may or may not have gotten hold of it, but whatever it was, we didn't want that out, so all of a sudden we had to invade Iraq. And why? Because of 9/11. And yet even President Bush himself admitted that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. So why did we invade Iraq? Well, first we were told that Saddam Hussein was going to have an atomic bomb to drop on us within just a few weeks. Well, that turned out not to be true. Then we were told, well, he's got weapons of mass destruction hidden away. Well, that turned out not to be true. Then it was, well, we're going to get their oil, get cheap oil. Well, that turned out not to be true because we weren't even getting as much oil out of Iraq as we were before we invaded. So finally it gets to, well, we had to invade them to bring freedom and democracy. And yet when Blackwater, that mercenary group, killed 40 or 50 people in one square over there in Iraq, and their provisional government, the one we put in power, said, "That's it, we want these guys out of here." The United States said, "Oh, no, we have contracts with them, they get to stay." How's that for freedom and democracy? So that's wrong. So what was it all about? Well, what happened in Iraq? We went and made a beeline for Baghdad, and in Baghdad, the Iraqi National Museum, which would have housed all of this ancient text, ancient tablets, ancient devices, which might have given us some insight into this ancient ET technology, was looted. And hundreds of thousands of pieces were taken, but the key to it is the basement, which has been called an inside job. And went in the basement where all the newly found stuff was, and they took hundreds of objects and things, and most of those have never been recovered. So I think the invasion of Iraq was primarily a black op to go into Baghdad to seize this ancient ET technology. But of course, that's, we can't talk about that.
Yeah,
that's potentially new weaponry.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got, national secrets that we've got to protect, of course, at the cost of your freedoms. Well, and oddly enough, with the recent occurrences in Egypt, it seems as though some of their museums were ransacked as well. And, of course, the information is yet to leak out as to what they may have lost or who might have perpetrated that particular offense. But it's sad to see these museums getting hit. You've presented so much information in your book. I wish we had a whole week to talk about it, Jim. It's really overwhelming, to be honest with you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to suggest that you pick up our Occulted History, Do the Global Elite Conceal Ancient Aliens? You can check out Jim's website at jimmars.com. And I appreciate you very much for speaking with us, and I hope we can have you back on the show again sometime.
That would be great, Chris. Thank you very much.
All right. You have a good one.
Good night.
Good night.